So let's hope so. Here this mic is on. Some notes of gratitude really to start with. First, many thanks for your very kind introduction. David, thanks for having us this evening. Closer to the mouth, is that okay? Okay, I can also try to speak up, just give me a shout. Thanks for having us this evening. Thanks for organizing this wonderful event. Thanks for producing this beautiful and really recommendable publication. If you haven't had a chance to have a look at it, it's a wonderful book, collecting so many different ideas and practices and sharing them. So it's really highly recommended to get a grip on this book and get one yourself. Since it's the celebration of a publication, part of this event at least is about celebrating this new volume, I thought I should start perhaps with a reference to another title, another book, which I see in relation to the one that we are discussing here. And the book I had in mind, there was also some resonance during the discussion, especially with some Shamus comments on technology and authoritarian politics in this context. The book I'm thinking about is titled Capital in the 21st Century by French political economist Thomas Piketty. And the central argument of his much lauded book is the key role of knowledge and skills for the equal distribution of wealth in our society. And so I think it's very relevant for a discussion here, for the debate about possibilities that arise when we share knowledge, when we share information and creativity. According to Piketty, the sharp rise in inequality since the 1980s, and he sees the only remedy that he sees here is either very strong economic growth, continued economic growth, or more dramatic taxation of wealth. That's his point that he's making in the book. But he sees this inequality that we are witnessing now due to particular distributional failures. That's what his book is about. And so when we are sort of bringing his argument into our context here, the context of data generating environments, then we can say that one of the failures that we are witnessing today has to do with distributional issues around the use of new data technologies. And although we've heard earlier on today that it's not so much about access, but we should pay much more attention, as it were, to attention. So attention is what's at stake here. But I think that, in fact, many of the technologies of data gathering and data extraction that are in use today are entirely inaccessible to us. And so it's easy for the accumulation and absorption of profit that they enable to benefit the few and not the many. Now, what's even worse in addition to the situation is that these inequalities are increasingly planned, they're realized, and they are regulated by means of structural interventions into urban space. So they're basically produced, they're created and realized as part of the production of the very space that is meant to be shared by all of us. Now, the ensuing problem of that is that we've arrived at a point not only in Central Europe or in Eastern Europe, elsewhere in Europe, but across the world, where city making has become an important domain in the consolidation of wealth concentration and not a domain of wealth distribution. And that's where my argument links up again with Thomas Piketty's work. So one of the key questions I think that we need to raise today is therefore how not just an elite of stakeholders, but every citizen can be involved in the production of our environments. And my suggestion is that for this we have to take into account at least two different things. And that's the sort of short talk, or rather short vignette of ideas that we are trying to deliver here is about. So one of the things is that our cities are increasingly data-driven environments. So we need to consider how the power unleashed by new digital technologies and big data can be used as an advantage, as something that works in favor of a wider spread of opportunities for self-determined engagement in the urban realm. And that's perhaps the more obvious point to make here. But the second point that I think really needs to be taken into consideration is that when we talk about civic engagement in the urban realm, civic engagement in cities, then this is not just about the consumption of a right to the city, to use this Lefebvre term in this context. But civic engagement should always be about collectively redefining the terms underlying the production of urban space. And there's a slight difference, but there's a real difference here. And I want to start out by talking about this second point here. And I want to keep it really short. So the question about citizen participation and why it is so important today in the urban realm. As I've just said, citizen engagement with data is not just about passive consumption of a particular right to the city, including the right to transparency, for instance, the right to information and to knowledge, which is obviously and understandably of significant relevance, not least in post-socialist context. But I think what's really at stake and for what we need to find perhaps the right terminology to get our heads around here is how citizen data interaction constitutes acts of production. So in other words, citizens are not simply recording something that is already out there waiting to be recorded. They don't simply detect external phenomena, but give rise to new experiencing entities. So the act of recording is simultaneously an act of creation, because it creates what emerges in the recording as entirely new entity, as an idea, a concept, a belief, a perception of life, or some other kind of element that is of relevance to us. And so the question of what is actually being recorded, as well as the way in which recordings are being made and shared, is of vital importance in this respect. And we often quote in this context our colleague Jennifer Gabris, who has coined the term creaturing here. Creaturing for her means that environmental data emerge not through universal forms or universal categories. So data is not reflecting something that is universally out there, just waiting to put into categories that we all know about, that we all share universally. It means that technologies of data extraction are bound up with the generation of new milieus, with new material assemblages and new relations. And this is precisely, for instance, what is meant by the speech of the becoming environmental of computation now. So two conclusions to finish here and then pass on to Helge. The first conclusion to be drawn is that data are not external to processes of civic and environmental creation, that they're part of these very processes. And the second conclusion to draw here is that there are no universal arrangements of data, but particular relations and particular material arrangement that data gathering only sets into place. And so it's in this sense then that we can just discuss the character of many different spatial sort of emancipatory practices that give authority to citizens themselves to create particular vectors of environmental participation. And the book that we are celebrating here today is truly a collection of many, many different such practices. That's why I pass on to Helge.
Well, thank you, Peter. I will continue sharing this platform which has been given to us. And as David has pointed out there, why we're also fascinated with this notion of sharing is, of course, that many of us have made this experience that sharing is not an act of dividing things up, but it's actually an act of enriching things. So there's this hope that by sharing things, the end result will be bigger than what we've started with. And so there are more conclusions to come with in this short time that we've been given. And please bear with me that I will stick very closely to my notes because these are fairly abstract ideas, which I hope we can give a bit more flesh to maybe in the discussion, but I want to be as precise as possible. Now, authority, this kind of authority that Peter has been speaking about, is given to citizens in perhaps the most obvious way when citizens actively contribute to the collection of data, for instance, when they report their own personal experiences in a particular situation, or when they get involved in so-called citizen sensing projects. And I think we've heard about similar initiatives in the initial launch of the book already. For instance, when we hear about bottom-up initiatives to democratize environmental data, measuring, for instance, air pollution and many other things. But we could argue that also just simply reading and accessing data provided by other parties is an act of production, as it contributes to the creation of what we might call environments of concern. It's an act of saying, well, these environments matter to us, they are relevant to us, and encourage our commitment. And this is really an important point that we want to make here, because often discussions depart from the assumption that there would be these very distinct realms, these very distinct moments of first accessing data or other kinds of information, then understanding that information, and in a third moment, reacting upon that information that we've gained. But what we want to suggest here is that maybe there's a kind of transversal terrain here, where we engage with information, and by this very act of engaging can contribute to something that then establishes these kind of environments of concern that might have wider ramifications without our possibility to clearly identify what kind of actions have been triggered by this kind of information. Now, given that there is an increasing interest in getting engaged in urban and rural environments that way, there might still be a difference between the access given to us and fully understanding what it is we have access to. One of the ideas of the panel, as it was proposed to us, is to think through the gap between an ever more open access to data and understanding the data we are presented with. And I think we need to posit this question in a wider context, extend its scope from a merely ethical demand, i.e. the demand to access and understand the information given to us, and situate it within the broader context of the political economy. So rather than lamenting the difficulties we are facing with open access to so much data that we can't really tackle on our own, and feeling obliged to get our heads around all that information so that we can fully participate in society and be productive citizens the way we should be, we could also spend our time thinking about why we are burdened with such tasks in the first place. Because in essence, we are dealing here with a civic demand, but in a sense that this demand pertains to how we are expected to perform our civic duties. In other words, with an interpellation in an Althusserian sense, an ideological process of subject formation that is embedded in economic realities. And it does make sense, because the issue of participation here is indeed a question of co-production. We are co-producing our environments not only as places to live in, but also, and increasingly so, as highly valuable economic assets. So by being tasked with understanding and making full use of the data we have access to, we are in essence beginning to work 24/7 in a way that makes our activities very difficult to differentiate and confine in conventional parameters like wage labor, for instance. So the constant demand to understand and be involved, to remain suitable for the circulation of creative potential, has given rise to a very diverse and economically profitable taskscape today. Informational labor performed by urban users for the benefit of platform companies, for instance, is not getting paid with monetary means, but incentivized by promises of improved urban experience, from emotional satisfaction to a sense of belonging and the enjoyment of particular privileges. And so it will be really important to critically observe the actual trade-offs involved with these deals. But the implications of participation can also be examined from the opposite end, not just from the perspective of the claimant wishing to participate, but from the end of granting the possibility to participate. So from the end of granting that moment that we can participate. And the brief for this debate tonight locates the problem in the discrepancy or gap between access and understanding, suggesting that the issue of access would have already been resolved. But I think we still need to look very carefully at how access is operated, how it is granted and actually functioning. And I really don't want to sound dismissive of the brief for this panel, because I'm very much aware that a lot of thinking has gone into this. And I think we've also heard during the launch that the issue of access has actually been mattered a lot during the production of this atlas itself. So as we've already pointed out, Today, a lot of access to data, but also to other elements, is structured and organized along platform technologies. Platforms are often promoted as a kind of superimposed infrastructure that provides a wider range of access. But they also gain control over access, so access becomes tied up with privilege. And you're probably very familiar with this slogan that millennials prefer access over ownership, and I'm not sure who would count themselves as millennials. But you know, this slogan sounds very initially sounds really great. But what we would argue is that this not necessarily implies the end of capitalist structures of property, even though it might sound, you know, with ownership no longer matters. But it's not about replacing property or the idea of property with collective operations of sharing. Instead, and this is our second very important point here, what's happening is that access is turned into a new and all-determining class of capital. Of course, access has been a key social determinant for a long time, structured along class, gender, racialized forms of discrimination, etc. But the difference here is that now access is traded as a capital commodity. So access is not just a means of political ordering, but a form of capital. A form of capital which is bound up with other novel currencies such as trust, social esteem, friendship networks, lifestyle attributes, etc. And platforms, which is the topic that we are currently working on a lot, provide here the technology to package access into such a tradable commodity. So by controlling access not just in the direct sense to consumer goods and services, but fundamentally reorganizing access to a wide range of fundamental domains, such as education, housing, healthcare, or even political information, which I think echoes the previous panel. Platforms are designed to become the most powerful players regulating the way we live in cities. And consequently, political struggles are going to arise in manifold ways around the question who controls access. Now, to bring these different lines of thinking together and to conclude here, we propose to think about access as the critical moment of defining the terms of sharing, rather than the moment of accepting the terms presented to us. In Erich Rogoff's word, access is, and I quote here, the ability to formulate one's own questions, as opposed to simply answering those that are posed to you in the name of an open and participatory democratic process, end of quote. So sharing knowledge across different members of society is never a level playing field. It is very clear that those who formulate the questions produce the playing field, while everyone else is just playing along. So as long as access is understood as something that is granted and often sold to us as users, subscribers, or followers, that will inevitably open up a gap of alienating tension. And I know I again might sound like ending on a rather pessimistic note, and this atlas is particularly about collecting examples and case studies that might be inspiring. And I think we do have some ideas how we can respond to this, but we just need to be very serious about what's really going on. And one proposal that we would want to make also for the discussion is there is this notion of the commons, let's say commons of data is very much circulating. But what we want to propose in relation to this couple of thoughts that we've presented here is that then thinking about commons, what's really important there is to think about the structures taking care of these commons. And you're probably also very familiar with that there's a lot of working on about the development of collective structures that can take care of the commons. So something that we would want to propose here also for the discussion is how we could think about, or how we could start thinking about, collective ways of taking care of structures of access. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen.